Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan making history by testifying at his corruption trial in Chicago and the beginning of a new General Assembly in Illinois. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan has discussed quid pro quo and distanced himself from Codefendant Michael McClain at their corruption trial in Chicago. Jim Talamonte reports.
Madigan said he developed a friendship with Michael McClain when they both served as state reps in the 1970s, and that their friendship survived until recently. Madigan appeared to be dismissive of McClain during cross-examination with McClain defense attorney Patrick Cotter. After hearing Chicago Alderman Daniel Solis use the words quid pro quo during a call in 2017, Madigan testified that he met with Solis face-to-face to say he would not be involved.
You made a comment that there was a quid pro quo.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Okay.
You shouldn't be talking like that.
Madigan and McClain are charged with bribery, racketeering, and official misconduct. Prosecutors may begin their cross-examination of Madigan on Monday. I'm Jim Talamonte.
Meanwhile, leadership of the Illinois House hasn't changed in the new General Assembly seated Wednesday. At a ceremony held at the University of Illinois Springfield, State Representative Chris Welch was reelected to be Speaker of the House for another term. He said his goal is to foster compassion.
So cruel and regressive policies that dehumanize our neighbors or strip away fundamental freedoms, I'm going to tell you right now, we will have no home in Illinois for those policies.
State Representative Toni McCombie was elected House Minority Leader. She noted, despite being in the super minority, they have a role.
Our caucus is focused on three things. 1, fostering economic growth. 2, cutting unnecessary spending. 3, and opposing any tax increases.
Legislators start the new General Assembly getting a bump in taxpayer-funded pay, making base pay of more than $93,000. Legislative leaders are paid an additional amount between $12,000 and $53,000 a year. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, January 9th. In a development that surprised many, longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan took the stand in his own corruption trial this week, testifying that he did not participate in any, quote, quid pro quo during his leadership days in Springfield. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, Illinois Associate Editor for the Center Square. Greg, let's start with the fact that Madigan actually took the stand in his own defense. This surprised me. How about you?
Yeah, you just remember, Dan, a few weeks ago we were talking about the prospect of whether or not Madigan would testify. This was, of course, after 10, 11, or 12 weeks of the prosecution presenting all of their witnesses, calling former state representatives, current state representatives, displaying all kinds of emails and documentation, and even airing in open court Madigan's voice on undercover recordings via video and wiretap phone calls. So Madigan's voice was heard in the court, but it was only from those various phone calls and recordings. And the prospect of whether Madigan would testify, somebody who's not a lawyer but has watched some criminal proceedings and various other court proceedings, sometimes it's not recommended that those who are the defense actually take the witness stand, because it opens them up to a whole host of other, some could see challenges in trying to defend their case. Because it's not just when somebody who's the defense gets on the witness stand answering questions from a friendly, like their defense attorney, it opens them up to the prosecution during cross-examination. So a lot of scuttle happened earlier this week when there was some rumblings that there was going to be a big development, and our reporter Jim Talamonte was in the courtroom monitoring the trial. He's been there for the duration of this in assistance with Brett Rowland as well with the Center Square. And then we found out, indeed, Madigan was going to testify, which was a huge surprise. And Jim said that the courtroom filled up even on that day. Earlier this week, several members of Madigan's family were there that hadn't been there before. So it was clearly a big breaking news development that the longest serving state house speaker in U.S. history was taking the witness stand in his own corruption trial. Now, only the defense has presented their side, having Madigan discuss his upbringing, his early childhood with his family, and talking about his marriage to his wife, and even adopting Lisa to be his daughter, Lisa Madigan, the former Illinois Attorney General. They discussed that. But we have yet to get to the point, Dan, and people are anxiously anticipating what's going to happen come Monday when the jury's back in, and you've got the prosecutors who are going to have their chance to cross-examine the former House Speaker. So how he's going to handle that, we'll have our eyes and ears in the courtroom with Jim Talamonte and Brett Rowland, making sure that we let people know exactly how Madigan's going to answer what's expected to be extremely tough questions coming from prosecutors alleging nearly a decade-long corruption scheme of trying to personally benefit himself and his allies by passing favorable legislation for large corporations like Utilities, ComEd, and AT&T.
Yeah, no court today in honor of former President Jimmy Carter's funeral procession, which is going on both in Washington, D.C., and then his burial in his hometown in Georgia. And Friday has been an off day for jurors. Some days, attorneys get with the judge to argue about what can be admitted to evidence, go over jury instructions and stuff like that. So the prosecution will not get an opportunity to cross-examine Speaker Madigan until Monday. But that's when it gets interesting. One of the things defendants often don't testify on their own behalf because they don't want to be caught lying under oath. That would be a crime in and of itself. Not saying Madigan lied, we had no idea or anything. But when the prosecution gets a hold of him and can start asking questions that Madigan might not be prepared for, that's when it gets interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, you can imagine, as there wasn't any court Thursday today when we were recording this, and they've had Fridays off all throughout the several months of the proceedings here. So I imagine that the prosecution team, again, the federal government, with the charges they brought against Madigan and Codefendant Mike McClain, they're probably putting in 40 hours just over the weekend in preparing for Madigan to testify. There's no doubt they always thought, well, it's possible Madigan could testify, right? These are seasoned prosecutors. They've been through their fair share of criminal proceedings, and they know how sometimes defendants don't want to testify, and that's their right. Defendant has absolutely every right in the U.S. Constitution to not testify. But surely they were thinking, well, we got to be prepared just in case Madigan does want to testify. So as the sidebars were happening discussing Madigan taking the witness stand, I'm sure prosecutors were already lining up all of the workload that they were going to have to put in over this weekend to prepare for the expectation of being able to ask Madigan questions while he's under oath.
You referenced his co-defendant, Michael McClain. They've been standing trial together since the beginning of October. Former colleagues and friends, close friends, not anymore, though. And it was clear during questioning of Michael Madigan that that's no longer the case. Before the trial started, McClain's attorneys actually filed a motion to try and seek to have them tried separately because they feared Madigan might put all of the blame for any potential wrongdoing on McClain. Anyway, during questioning of Madigan, it was clear that they're no longer tight as they used to be. What was one of the questions? Cotter asked the attorney, one of the defense attorneys asked if McClain was a master of understanding House rules and how things worked in Springfield. Madigan's response was, Mike knew his way around, but you shouldn't elevate him that high, Madigan said. So anyway, this case gets really interesting beginning Monday. Any idea how long prosecutors will cross-examine him? Will it be the full day? Will it be multiple days? I guess we don't know, huh?
I fully anticipate it's going to take several days for the prosecution team. I don't think it's just going to be one prosecutor raising questions. It could be several. But again, Madigan opened himself up to cross-examination by being willing to testify. And one thing that we've seen so far with how Madigan's defense team's been asking Madigan questions, it feels that Madigan's defense team is trying to put a lot of this on McClain. Right. For instance, Madigan said that he didn't know that some of the allies and associates were getting do-nothing job contracts and saying that, well, they should have worked, and saying that McClain, he'd often, rely on McClain to take care of certain things, but wasn't aware of McClain, how he would go about taking care of these particular requests, and also saying, listen, job recommendations are a regular occurrence when it comes to government officials and some of their allies looking for work and knowing their experience and being able to make those recommendations. But some of the line of questioning and the responses of Madigan indicate that he seems to be putting this on McClain. And as you mentioned, Madigan did testify that they're no longer friends as they were. But with how the questions and responses from Madigan and his defense team while Madigan's on the witness stand, it's becoming clear that Madigan's distanced himself from McClain and seeming to play ignorance into what McClain may have been doing. Now, keep in mind, all throughout the prosecution's case, before they wrapped things up as the defense was preparing their case, some of the recordings were very cloak and dagger type of operations where they wouldn't even use Madigan's name when McClain was talking to various sources. McClain would say "our friend," and even at one time, there's tape of McClain chastising somebody for using Madigan's name at a cafe, and somebody overhearing that and saying that we have to, essentially shield that and say it's our friend. So how the prosecution may dip back into that and Madigan's awareness of McClain's happenings and doings, this is really a historic moment in Illinois history when it comes to the prospect and the perception of Illinois corruption and how pay-to-play works and how the glad handing and how legislation moves through the General Assembly, and Madigan's nexus of power as being not just the House Speaker for more than 30 years, but also being the chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, which Madigan said he was a proud Democrat. Clearly, all eyes are on Madigan right now as he chose to take the witness stand, and we'll see a lot of fireworks coming out of that courtroom, I'm sure, all throughout the week next week.
And listeners can keep up with all developments in the corruption trial of former House Speaker Michael Madigan at thecentersquare.com. Members of the 104th Illinois General Assembly were sworn into office this week. Not a whole lot of activity was taken during this new session. No leadership changes. They did vote on the speakership, and Senate President Don Harmon reelected Senate President Emanuel Chris Welch reelected House Speaker. When can we actually expect new action from the General Assembly?
And, before we talk about the new General Assembly, we also have to touch on lame duck session, which wrapped up the 103rd General Assembly. And, they were scheduled to come back on the 2nd, but they actually didn't come back until Saturday, the 4th, when it was right before a snowstorm crippled the capital city. Areas got between 8 to 12 inches of snow that started early Sunday. But they came in Saturday, didn't do anything. Both chambers. They just gavelled in and gavelled out, maybe some points of personal privilege. Some Republicans complained about how it was a waste of time, how it was a waste of taxpayer resources to be there. But then they really did get to work on Sunday, while, again, the capital city was practically shut down because of the snowstorm. And they passed some pretty controversial legislation Sunday and Monday. And even into Tuesday, late into the evening, the House was in session till close to 10 or 10:30 at night on Tuesday evening, the final full day of the 103rd General Assembly. Just a quick overview of some of the more controversial pieces of legislation both chambers passed. They essentially are going to repeal the requirement that somebody legally changing their name publish that in a newspaper. Those who are going through the courts to change their name, they can request that that file be essentially kept under lock and key, so it doesn't have to be published. Republicans said this is a huge loophole that they fear is going to allow non-citizen migrants in the state to change their name and cloak their true identity from not just U.S. officials, but also from foreign officials. So that measure ultimately passed despite those concerns from Republicans. Another big bill that passed, we talked about this before, Dan, the enhancement of the state's so-called red flag laws. When somebody is the subject of an order of protection in a domestic violence situation, current law says that their FOID card's suspended and they're supposed to surrender their firearms to somebody else who's eligible to take those firearms. For instance, if John Q. Public has an order of protection against them, they can give it to John Q. Public Jr., who has a FOID card, and that person can hold those firearms for that individual. While the law that passed, Karina's law, that is likely going to be on the governor's desk soon, and he'll sign it, it's essentially requires that under certain circumstances, through court proceedings, that if somebody's the subject of an order of protection, then police are to confiscate those firearms. Now, Republicans and gun rights advocates said nobody wants a domestic violence abuser to have access to firearms, but everybody has a right to due process. And they point to recent U.S. Supreme Court precedent in the case United States versus Rahimi that was actually decided this past summer. A very similar type of case. And the Supreme Court said, listen, everybody has due process rights. And in order for somebody's Second Amendment rights to be restricted, they have to have their day in court. And the way it's set up is Republicans say that's not granted in this law that's being prepared to be signed by the governor that passed both chambers during lame duck session. So clearly we're going to hear a lot more about that bill. I imagine lawsuits are going to be filed around the issue of the measure not having due process involved, so that the accused person can actually have their day in court before their rights are suspended. So you'll hear a lot about that. There was other measures about energy policy that passed in both chambers, essentially laying out a variety of different measures impacting the state's energy policy. And Republicans said they were frustrated because there weren't any assurances that the various things they did concerning renewable energy, changing some of the timelines on how quick renewable energy portfolio is going to grow in Illinois and the subsidies that are going to be involved in all of this. Republicans were looking for assurances that it was not going to increase how much ratepayers are paying. They were also really frustrated with the amount of subsidies that could be going for so-called renewable energy. So that measure also passed. There was things that passed concerning labor issues in Chicago, and I think even I'll have to double check on this, but they moved forward with making the soybean the official bean of Illinois. So the lame duck session obviously advanced. They wrapped things up Tuesday. The 104th General Assembly was seated Wednesday, some pomp and circumstance, and a lot of congratulatory speeches for newly elected individuals.
Right.
But then today, Dan, Thursday, before they adjourned for the next 2 weeks, they come back January 28th. Both chambers passed rules for how the House and the Senate operate. And in the House, speaking back to former Speaker Mike Madigan, Republicans said the rules that passed the House, giving Democrats a substantial amount of power on how they pass legislation and possibly freeze out Republican constituents' concerns, are the same rules that Mike Madigan had in place for decades.
Right.
So the legislature's back in session. They've already filed more than 1,100 bills in the House. It hasn't even been 24 hours, Dan.
I want to go back to lame duck just real quick. One thing that did not get done in lame duck was something that Governor Pritzker was pushing for, and that had to do with the regulations on the hemp industry. There was a lengthy behind closed door meeting of the Democratic caucus where members of Pritzker's administration were at that we heard got somewhat contentious.
No question. And this was, obviously an issue that was pretty, apparent. It was controversial during spring session back in May. And essentially what they're wanting to do is you've got the legal adult use cannabis industry. Cannabis is an intoxicating substance. But with the federal farm bill, I believe that passed in 2018, some restrictions on hemp were relaxed. So the hemp industry, which isn't considered an intoxicant on the surface, you can use hemp for a variety of things, oils, textiles, and such. But there's other derivatives that can be drawn from hemp. Some people may have heard of Delta 8 or Delta 9. These are concentrates of the hemp product that could be intoxicating. And they put them into gummies and candies and things like that. And a lot of these products look like, what you might find at a candy store, but they just changed the name of it slightly. So Governor Pritzker, after a lot of debates during spring session last month, he came out and supported regulations on the hemp industry. And that seemed to be, the governor, he's obviously the most powerful Democrat in the state of Illinois. He's the governor. He's a billionaire. He's, a lot of his priorities have been rubber stamped by the Democrat legislature. But this issue in particular, the contention was made clear when it was apparent that this bill was not going to pass during lame duck session. And the governor revealed at a news conference earlier this week that they had tried to have a meeting of the governor's staff with members of the Democratic House in a caucus. And the governor said that his staff members left afraid because they were being chastised and, verbally ripped apart by members of the Democratic caucus. And he said that was very off-putting and nerve-wracking. So clearly, Pritzker did not get that initiative across the finish line as he had hoped for before the end of lame duck session. This is going to be an issue for the spring session of the 104th General Assembly, no question. But I tell you, Dan, the new General Assembly has a tall order because it's not just issues like hemp. They're going to have to tackle a potential $3 billion budget deficit for the next fiscal year. And cursory review of the 1,100 bills that have been filed so far for the 104th General Assembly, we anticipate there's going to be thousands more filed. But so far, there are a lot of different tax and fee increases that have been proposed, and how those are going to play into how they try to shore up money for the state budget if they don't find cuts and try to relax some of the extra spending that taxpayers are on the hook for. That's going to be the main point of contention. There's going to be plenty of other issues the 104th General Assembly is going to bring up. They're back January 28th, and we'll be there on the ground watching everything play by play.
Greg, thank you for joining us today. As Greg just said, follow thecentersquare.com for all the news you need to know about your pocketbook and everything else at thecentersquare.com.